two topics within the broad world of forestry. So if you are excited about forestry and want to learn more, please reach out to me. You'll have my contact information at the very end. So we're going to talk about land ownership today and a little bit about wildfires, since those are two issues that are most certainly bilateral between the US and Canada, and where both countries kind of impact the other with respect to all of these trends. So first, just a little primer. The USDA Forest Service, where I did work before coming to MSU, is sort of our premier source for data when it comes to numbers of trees we have, tree species we have across our landscapes, and volume of trees. Not just that, but the Forest Service is continually collecting data on who owns America's forests, which is one of the topics we're digging into today. So this little figure on the, well, for you, the right, shows the ownership breakdown for Michigan specifically. So that 62%, that kind of teal, big, giant pie slice, is private forest ownership. So although public lands are really important right here in downtown Lansing in terms of our governance with state land in that green color and national forests in the light blue, you can see that private forest lands are of paramount importance for the state of Michigan and for many other states in the United States. Why do we care about private lands? It's complicated. So private lands can be broken down into what we would think of as corporate owners. So these are companies, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those in a minute. But also individual and family forest owners who might have very different ownership motivations. Many of you may own forests and own those forests for reasons like they're beautiful, they provide privacy, I can go hunt there, I can take my family there. So they're going to manage those forest lands very differently than a company who is working towards a bottom line, for example, or who is supplying our wood products industry. So that's kind of why we care. Wanted to point out too, though, that the Forest Service at this point, when tracking corporate ownership, that category includes both domestic industrial forest owners and foreign-owned companies that own that land in Michigan. So focusing again on private forest land, as I mentioned, this includes those families and individuals and corporate. That corporate category can be broken down into, for example, the forest products industry. You may have heard of a large forest products industry company called Weyerhaeuser. They no longer own land in Michigan, but they do own land nationally. And there's also investments by these two categories of organization, a timber management organization, or TIMO, a real estate investment trust. And this is kind of a byproduct of a change in tax law in the 1950s. That meant that a lot of forest products companies divested themselves of forest land. They were previously vertically integrated, so they owned the land where the trees grew, they owned the sawmill where they processed the trees, and then suddenly it was no longer profitable to do so, so they divested themselves of the land. So now we have forest land owned by entities like these timber investment management organizations, and then we have forest products companies that own the infrastructure that processes that fiber. Also in the private bucket are non-governmental conservation organizations. I think I saw a gentleman from the Nature Conservancy owns quite a bit of land in Michigan. Unincorporated townships, associations, clubs. There are many hunting clubs that own thousands of acres in Michigan as well, and they all have very different motivations. And then lastly, we have our Indigenous, Native American, and Indian communities, which we would also categorize as private because, again, of those differing ownership motivations than, say, the state or national ownership categories. So why is this important? Why do we need policy that impacts private lands? Well, when you think about that 62% pie chart chunk, we have to ensure that we have sustainable fiber for the future. We're all sitting here using many products that are made out of fiber from trees, and we want to make sure that that exists in perpetuity to supply those products. So if all of that fiber is coming from 62% of land owned by millions of individuals and corporations, it's important to think about how we can ensure that we have that fiber in the future. Also to encourage investment in those lands and ensure that they remain forests, to increase overall economic production within the state, and to help deal with externalities and market failures. I'll be the first to say, I am not an economist, but I do know that those things are important. And just this figure here on the right shows the breakdown of that ownership by the broader regions within Michigan. So eastern and western UP, northern and southern lower peninsula. So still predominance of privately owned land, but it fluctuates a little bit by region, just how much of that land is privately owned. And most importantly, why we have private lands policy is that family forest owners often do not manage their forests without some sort of incentive, regulation, motivation, you name it. I have spent the better part of 15 years trying to understand family forest owners through my research program, and it is a very difficult nut to crack. If any of you have figured it out, please let me know. This may be familiar to some of you, but just wanted to be sure for those of you who haven't been exposed that we do have some of those incentive programs to encourage our landowners to manage their land. And when I say manage, I don't necessarily mean manage through harvesting or active management. More so thinking about their land, their 40, their 100, their 1,000 acre parcel, and what they want that land to do for them. That's kind of our goal in the forestry professionals community, is just to make sure landowners know what options are available to them and help them reach those goals. For some, it is harvesting timber and making some sort of income from that land. For others, it is just enjoyment, managing for wildlife, etc. These two programs exist to help landowners who want to actively manage for timber. Commercial forest program has a much higher acreage minimum threshold and gives a much bigger tax break. Also, you are required to allow recreation, so you folks can come onto the land by foot only. And qualified forest property program is for the smaller landowners who benefit from a reduced millage rate but are not required to allow public access on their property. In both cases, these programs require a management plan. So again, that sort of engagement with landowners and say, all we want is for you to have a plan. What you do with it from there, it's up to you, your goals, etc. But both of these programs end up catering to, in terms of commercial forest, the larger corporate owners, and in terms of QFP, to the smaller family forest owners. Just one note, since we are talking about kind of this bilateral forest ownership, I always think of tree ecosystems as really not respecting political boundaries. Trees are just going to grow back and forth across the borders of the US and Canada, but we as political and social creatures manage these systems based on where we are in our local politics. So this is a map that recently came out, and I've got a few copies here from the Society of American Foresters article about concentration of foreign holdings of forest land. So we now have this AFIDA database that can track where corporate investment, foreign corporate investment is happening with respect to forest lands. So you can kind of see the darker blue means more acres. So Maine is by far and away the state with the largest number of acres that are owned by foreign entities, but that UP of Michigan dark blue color there is relevant to us today. And then that little graph on the right-hand side kind of shows, of the 3 Great Lakes states, Michigan has seen more foreign investment of forest lands within the state. So that ownership increased by about 53%, or about 14 million acres from 2012 to 2022 to 21 million acres. So as of December 2022, I think overall foreign ownership of ag and forest land was about 43%, and forest made up 48%, whereas cropland was 28%. Speculating, but Canadian forest investment is probably due to similarity of forest types. We have forest types that Canadian companies are very familiar with and understand how to manage, how to market, and that's an understanding of sort of the general ecological and social characteristics. Okay, moving quickly ahead, because we've got a lot to get through. One other policy issue we wanted to talk about today are the wildfires. So there, as Rebecca mentioned, there's a policy brief on the back table there that gives lots and lots of rich detail on wildfires as a general concept, but also as kind of a socio-political situation. This graph here just shows the number of fires over time in Canada, and then the average area burned in those orange-ish bars. So what you can kind of glean from this graph really quickly is that it's not necessarily that the numbers of fires have dramatically increased. It's that in recent years, in 2023 in particular, the fires were very, very large. We kind of call them catastrophic wildfires because they burned vast, vast hectares, if you're in Canada, acres if you're here, of land. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is the case. So one thing that rose to kind of public attention over the last few years is the impacts from smoke from those wildfires. So research, I'd say, is sort of nascent, still emerging, but some kind of common sense things we know that might happen when there's smoke from wildfires is potentially a loss in productivity, work days, perhaps a decline in tourism revenue, housing prices, potentially crop productivity, though I will say that research is still ongoing, and thus an increase in government spending if you're dealing with increased health issues from smoke inhalation. So this graph is days of smoke per year for the Midwestern US, so that darkish purple all the way to the end of the spectrum is 40 days per year of wildfire smoke. So something we obviously want to think about and want to address, but I will counterbalance that by saying Michigan has a relatively low wildfire risk, though it is expected to increase. So the graph on the left shows number of fires by cause in Michigan. And that kind of tallest bar there is debris burning, so that's kind of a human cause. But there are also other causes of wildfires that we have no control over. So lightning strikes would be kind of the primary one where we would call it sort of the act of God. And then the figure on the right is total acres burned in Michigan over time. So we had some pretty tough fire years in 2007 and 2012. Those are about 20,000 and a little over 20,000 acres respectively. But generally speaking, that is a very low number compared to some of our states out in the western United States. Canada, on the other hand, has a relatively high risk, in part because of those boreal systems to the north that are harder to access and are therefore have not historically, or should say in recent history, been burned through preemptive, we call them prescribed burns, difficult to access for management, so difficult to get material out of the forest. There's a lot of forest material sitting in those forests, which are already fire-prone ecosystems, simply meaning the species of trees naturally regenerate and grow in the presence of fires. They have these cones that open when there are hot fire conditions, essentially. And generally speaking, both the US and Canada have had a relatively long history of fire suppression, meaning we just don't want fires to happen in the first place, and when they happen, we put them out. One thing I will say though is that looking at the statistics over the last few years in Canada, lightning ignited fires were 93% of the total area burned. So again, these would be considered acts of God. That's not to say that there aren't human-induced wildfires in both the US and Canada. But in some cases, preventing fires from starting by saying, don't have your campfire going when the conditions are poor, or don't set off fireworks, sort of pale in comparison to some of the other risk mitigation tools we can use. Wanted to compare and contrast, though, Canadian forest ownership patterns with what we have in the US. So this is probably a little tough to see, but we'll share these slides out. So that dark green color that kind of covers most of the lower provinces, it's called long-term tenure, which essentially means that it is crown land that's managed for sort of the public good. And this is again in contrast to that category I'm calling private ownership, where the governance is up to all of those individuals, families, and corporations. So the kind of orangish color, you can see the rust orangish color, is the private category in Canada, so a fairly small proportion of land. So I'd say at least for the eastern seaboard and Midwest, the pattern kind of flips. In Canada, they have more of a public governance model for forests, and here we have to focus much more on our private forest lands. Then taking a look at fires, so this was 2023, these were the big major fires that occurred. You can kind of see a lot of these, the dots, the pinpoints, are in those publicly managed long-term tenure forests, where again, access can be difficult to remove material. It is just generally a wicked problem with respect to forest management. So when we talk about wildfire prevention, risk reduction, for me, the key is forest management. So there are many who would say, the best thing we can do for these systems is leave them alone, and I don't think we have that option anymore. So necessary forest management tools for wildfire risk reduction include things like thinning or harvesting. So removing some of that woody material from the forest means there's less of it to burn, so that when fires start, which are a natural part of the ecosystem, they don't become catastrophic. They become sort of these surface level fires that more or less do what they're supposed to do for forest health and regeneration. Prescribed burning, I use that term again, so that's intentionally setting a fire in a very controlled manner with the same basic goal. Lower that total amount of fuel, so that next bullet point is fuel reduction. That's kind of a broad category that includes prescribed burning, but the overall goal is just reduce the amount of fuel. And then hazard mitigation where we need to. So we know that there are human beings that live in a lot of these fire-prone ecosystems, or at least close to these fire-prone ecosystems. So how can we help them prepare for the eventuality of fire in their woods? The other kind of two drivers that I think are relevant to policy here to enable those forest management tools include, what do we do with the wood that we're removing from these systems? So you're probably all familiar, with a beautiful big saw log that can be shipped off and turned into 2x4s and various other dimensional products. We also need something to do with the smaller material that we're taking off of these lands to reduce wildfire risk. So things like woody biomass for energy, things like using lower grade material for engineered wood products like mass timber, all become really important solutions to engage in wildfire risk reduction. But we do sometimes fight an uphill battle with social acceptability of those types of uses for trees. I will say though, and again, not an economist, but recent research suggests that for every $1 invested in fuel reduction treatments, there's a $6 return on reduced impacts from these catastrophic wildfires, whether it's health issues related to smoke, whether it's loss of infrastructure, personal human safety, and degradation of those ecosystem services that forests provide. So thinking about this kind of US, Canada, what can we do together? What should we be doing separate that helps the other? I'd say for both countries, there's a push to reframe from this decades-long policy position of fire suppression to one of risk mitigation, manage our forests, and think about how to do that collectively. And for the US, I think it's important to consider that commercial forest program as well. So what are the precise goals for that program? And also to think about this increase in foreign-owned land, foreign investment in corporate land, particularly in the Upper Peninsula, and how we can better design the commercial forest program to evolve with these evolving land ownership patterns. Sometimes the landowner may be from Canada, from Western Europe, but the actual company has people who live and work in Michigan managing those lands. Other times, not so much. So I think it's important to take a look at who's actually doing the on-the-ground work, who's making those decisions, and whether the commercial forest program is working in the ways that it's intended. Also, there are opportunities to incentivize those individuals and family forest owners for more than just harvesting. So there's new and emerging programs that actually compensate landowners for the things they provide to us, like clean drinking water and clean air, where the loss of those forests would diminish those services. So I'm happy to talk more about any of you about those opportunities. That's one thing that we're pursuing with the Michigan Forest Association, which I also represent, which represents those small individual and family forest owners. Okay, I tried to go real fast, so we have a lot to get to. This is a little screenshot of the many topics that I work on in the department. So that fire on the landscape square was just meant to remind me that we do have another set of policy briefs that are focused particularly on fire and kind of a social policy perspective. But we also have briefs on all of these different topics. If any of that is of use to you, those are my contact details and then the website for our general department. So thank you all for your attention.
Thanks so much, Professor Silver. And she'll be around until 1, I think, for questions after Dr. Ortega gives his presentation. So I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. David L. Ortega. As I mentioned, he's the Noel Stuckman Chair in Food Economics and Policy at Michigan State University. His research focuses on decision-making in agri-food systems and how economic forces shape food and agricultural markets and policy. His recent work examines the drivers of state legislative activity restricting foreign ownership of agricultural land, including forest land. Dr. Ortega has been invited to testify before the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives Agricultural Committees on foreign ownership in U.S. agriculture. His broader policy work has included advising the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Department of Justice, Federal Reserve banks, and the state of Michigan on issues ranging from agricultural trade to food prices and supply chains. His research and commentary are regularly featured in outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Financial Times, and CNN. Beyond today's discussion on foreign agricultural land ownership, Dr. Ortega is happy to serve as a resource on broader agricultural and food economy questions relevant to Michigan policymakers. So thank you, Dr. Ortega.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you, Dr. Malouin. Thank you for that introduction. I'm David Ortega, professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics, where I hold the Noel Stuckman Chair in Food Economics and Policy. And Rebecca did a really nice summary of my background and the work that I do. I just sort of want to highlight that what I'll be talking about today is just one small piece of my research program. Much more recently, I've been engaged on agricultural trade and policy issues, and also looking at issues of food price inflation, which may also be of interest to many of you here in the audience. At Michigan State, I teach in both the undergraduate and graduate program, a course in food marketing, and then a graduate course in food and agricultural policy. And Rebecca also nicely summarized my policy experience. I've had the opportunity and privilege to work with policymakers at both the state and federal level. And you'll see me talk about a study that we did looking at foreign ownership in U.S. agriculture. And that really stemmed from a Senate agriculture hearing in the U.S. Congress, where I was invited to testify by Senator Stabenow that looked at foreign ownership in U.S. agriculture. And so this is an issue that has gotten a lot of attention both at the federal but also at the national level. And so just a quick outline of the next 15 minutes or so. I'll give a snapshot of what foreign holdings of agricultural land look like in the United States. Then we look a little bit more closely at Michigan, look at Canadian holdings of forest land in particular here in the States, and then I'll talk about that study that we did that looked at state drivers of legislative actions to restrict foreign ownership, and tried to also shed some light on some misunderstandings surrounding foreign ownership in U.S. agriculture, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. Now, I want to start off, so I mentioned agricultural land quite a bit, and that is because the U.S. includes forest land as part of their definition for agricultural land. One term that I want to bring your attention to, and I know Emily mentioned it, is AFIDA, and that is the 1978 Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act that requires reporting of foreign holdings of U.S. agricultural land. Now, a couple things here. When we talk about agricultural land, that includes cropland, forest land, pasture land, and other use of agricultural land, but holdings refers to both outright ownership as well as long-term leases, which USDA defines as being 10 years or more. And we'll talk about how that breaks down both at the national level, but also here in the state of Michigan. So here we have sort of the national level picture of foreign holdings of state privately held agricultural land. Now, AFIDA, the latest AFIDA data that we have goes through 2023. And it shows that we have foreign held agricultural land in all 50 states, and they total about 45 million acres, or roughly 3.5% of all privately held agricultural land in the United States. Now, with the exception of Maine, reported holdings are really concentrated in the South as well as Western states. And Michigan ranks number 6 in terms of acreage. So we have about 1.8 million acres of foreign held agricultural land here in the state. That makes up about 8 or so percent of all privately held agricultural land in Michigan, which makes Michigan come in at around number 3 nationwide. Now, that percentage, Maine has about 21% of their privately held agricultural land as foreign held. A lot of that is forest land, and primary ownership there is from Canada. Now, who owns this land? Here we have the top 20 countries with the most holdings of land here in the US. Canada, no surprise, is the number 1 foreign holder at about 15 million or so acres, followed by the Netherlands, then Italy, the UK, a lot of EU countries. We have Switzerland there, Mexico, roughly 684,000 acres, and then very much at the bottom of this list, we have China that owns between 250 and 300,000 acres of agricultural land, privately held agricultural land here in the United States. A couple things that I want to point out here. A lot of the discussion surrounding foreign holdings of agricultural land have really centered on China, and I'll explain why that's been the case a little bit later on. But it's important to keep in mind that with some exceptions, and including here in Michigan, foreign governments don't necessarily directly own land here in the United States. It's primarily companies, private individuals, LLCs, that have ownership of land, and they are just from those other countries. So that's important to keep in mind. We talk about Chinese holdings or Canadian holdings. It's not necessarily the government of those countries that own the land here in Michigan or in the US. And then in the case of China, which I know has gotten a lot of attention, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of Chinese holdings, again, we're talking about 267,000 acres, are fairly concentrated in southern states. Some of these belong to companies like Smithfield Foods, which is now owned by a Chinese company that's the largest pork processor that was acquired back in 2014, 2015. ChemChina, which was Syngenta, sort of a Chinese-owned company now, represent a big share of Chinese-held agricultural land here in the United States. There's also a billionaire investor that's interested in energy projects that make up that share there. Now, when we focus on Michigan, so here we have the last 20 years of data, so going back to 2003, we had about 300,000 acres that were foreign owned in Michigan, and that has really ramped up to about 1.8 million acres of foreign held agricultural land in the states. Again, it still represents 8% of all privately held land here in Michigan. And what's important to also point out is that 92% of that is outright owned by some of these entities, as opposed to long-term leases. And forest land takes up about 90% of all foreign held agricultural land here in the state, of which the vast majority is outright owned, as opposed to these 10-year leases or longer. Now, as Emily pointed out, foreign holdings of forest land in Michigan are concentrated in the Upper Peninsula, and most of it is intended to stay as forest land. And we get that information from the AFIDA database. Now, there's a lot of issues with AFIDA, and that was part of the discussion that we had in the US Senate Ag Committee at the hearing, is that we see these trends that I just pointed out here, and especially when we zoom out to the national level, the changes that you see reported from AFIDA from year to year may not necessarily reflect actual changes in ownership. There's a lot of errors in the data. Up until very recently, it was all done with paper and pencil. It relies on self-reporting. Now that's being digitized, but that's as of just a couple of years ago. So every time a new report comes out, a lot of the changes that you might be seeing are actually reconciliation of errors that were found in the data. And that's certainly been the case when it comes to Chinese ownership. The actual numbers have decreased in the last couple of reports, and it's just primarily because of errors. A lot of people have found that there might be extra zeros that get entered into the database. So here we have, so the database tells us what that land is intended for once it's purchased, and most of it is intended to stay as forest land, especially in the Upper Peninsula. Now, the top 3 countries that hold Michigan forest land, the number 1 is Singapore, about 30%, and a lot of that is part of their sovereign wealth fund. Then you have the Netherlands at 26%, and then Canada comes in at number 3. So 20% of foreign-held forest land belongs to Canadian interests. When it comes to Canadian holdings of Michigan forest land, 99% of that is held by 2 companies. And this again is just coming out of the IPPSR database. And the principal place of business for these companies, as is reported, is the United States. It may just be that the actual beneficiary of this land resides in Canada. But by and large, it's sort of these large companies, and then you do have some private owners that come up in the IPPSR database. Now, when we talk about foreign ownership, one thing that I think it's important to point out is that there have been a lot of efforts at the state level nationwide to restrict foreign ownership. And so we had 2 proposals here in Michigan last year, House Bill 4233 and House Bill 4234, that sought to prohibit foreign principal from acquiring land, including forest land here in the state. Now, House Bill 4234 prohibits any interest of foreign principal within 20 miles of any military installation or a key facility within this state. Now, the current versions of these bills have passed the House, but they don't prohibit Canadian holdings of US privately held agricultural land. And the key thing here is that foreign principal is defined as either the government official, or a person that has ties to the government of one of these foreign countries of concern. So the People's Republic of China, Russian Federation, Iran, Cuba, Syria. And if you recall the graph that I showed, by and large, foreign holdings of US agricultural land are in the hands of what we would typically refer to as very friendly nations towards the United States. In this list, the one that stands out is China. And again, recall that we were talking about less than 300,000 acres nationwide. So this sort of led, and sort of following the hearing that we had in DC, it sort of led to this study that we conducted, and it was recently published, that looks at drivers of state legislative actions to restrict foreign holdings of US agricultural land. On the right here, this is for all 50 states. You have the number of proposals that were introduced at the state level that sought to restrict some type of agricultural land, and we see that that really skyrocketed starting in 2021. By 2023, the majority of states in the country had at least one bill that was proposed that would restrict ownership of US agricultural land by foreigners. And by 2023, we had about 16 states that had actually passed the bill that would restrict foreign ownership. And so what we did, a PhD student of mine who recently graduated worked with me on trying to analyze what were the drivers of these state legislative actions, because a lot of the action was really happening at the state level. So what we did is we compiled a data set of all state legislators in 49 of the 50 states. So we took Nebraska out. They have a unicameral system in the legislative branch. But we literally compiled a data set of all state legislators from 2021 to 2023, included their own demographic characteristics, but also committee membership, tenure in their committees, district characteristics, and we connected that to both bill proposal and bill voting behavior. Now, we also did an analysis at the state level that took into account both legislative and political factors, so looking at political affiliation of the governor and in control of the House and the Senate. We looked at demographic factors within the state, but also agricultural factors, how big of a agricultural sector that state has, Where are they exporting a lot of their agricultural products? And then looking at foreign ownership of agricultural land within the state, how much of that belonged to China? Did China have any ownership within the state? And so we did the analysis on that, and we found that really the motivation behind these legislative efforts, first and foremost, was to really protect state agricultural assets and restrict further foreign holdings. So we found that states that had a higher percentage of foreign held agricultural land were more likely to pass a bill that would restrict foreign ownership. Political factors also came to the surface pretty quickly, so party affiliation was probably one of the strongest predictor of both bill proposal and bill passage. But also issues of national security came up. So if a state had the number of military bases or key and sensitive facilities, would result in a higher probability that the state would move to pass a bill that would restrict foreign ownership. Same when it came to Chinese ownership within the states. If there were the higher share of Chinese ownership within a state, that resulted in a state being more likely to pass one of these bills to restrict foreign ownership. But interestingly, as an economist, I found this fascinating, economic considerations also came in. So if a state exported a lot of their agricultural products to China, they were less likely to pass a bill that would restrict foreign ownership. And so it was interesting that sort of economic considerations really played a role in these decisions. And so really what we find is that it's sort of a delicate balance between national security concerns, but also economic interests that are driving legislative activities at the state level. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. If you're interested in finding out more about our study, there's a QR code here that will take you to a summary that also has a link to the published paper, but also remain available after today to answer any questions. And I know we'll have a Q&A here in a few minutes. So thanks for your attention.
And Emily. All right, so I am going to, we have Tony walking around with the mic if you guys have questions. I'm going to start us off with a couple. One, I mean, obviously, it seems like Michigan is one of the unique states that has a little bit of foreign interest. So I guess for Emily, one question I had, you mentioned about private land policy. Is there any difference in how foreign companies manage their forestry in terms of practices that sort of relate to, is there some reason why foreign companies versus U.S. companies have differences in how they manage their land? You know, in some cases that might be good reasons or bad, good policies or bad policies, or sort of different ones that take advantage of sort of things we have in Michigan. And then broadly, I guess this is for David and both of you, is I just want to press you, it seems like we're unique. What advantages or what sort of opportunities does this present to have sort of this level of sort of foreign corporate interest in, agricultural land that we have in Michigan? So I don't know if Emily wants to start first.
Sure, yeah, so I think the answer to whether there's a difference in a foreign corporate entity versus a domestic is probably, I'd say the reason to invest in forest land in the United States, if you're a larger company from another country, is probably not to go hunting and for privacy and aesthetic enjoyment, sort of as we were talking about. Rather, it's for economic return. That's not to say that corporations in the US that are investing in forest land don't have the same motivations, but often they are considering all of those other factors and also the communities in which they live and the access that those communities might have to that forest land. I'd say the other potential difference is that other countries have different cultures and motivations around how they manage forests, their perspectives on the management of forests. So we may see some differences in the harvesting systems that they employ and the equipment that they purchase, so like differences that may seem minor but do result in different outcomes on the landscape. But to speak to opportunities, I think the opportunities are also there. So there's material on both sides of the border that can, for lack of a better word, feed the forest products industry in different ways. So there may be different species mixes, different age classes, and structural characteristics of trees that we might benefit from that exist in Canada for some of our mills and manufacturers, and that they might benefit from our tree species and mixes. So I think it can kind of go both ways, and that's the nod I made to thinking about the commercial forest program. Is that's one of our best tools to sort of take a look at what's actually happening on the ground, because there's accountability through that program for what these corporate investors are doing, and think about how we can use that program to see the outcomes we want from a forestry perspective on the landscape. So, okay.
Yeah, happy to add to what Emily said. I think, when we look at motivations of these companies, like Emily said, it's really economic. When we look at investments in land, stable returns are less risky, and that's what we tend to see, and that's why I think we've seen such an uptick in foreign holdings in U.S. agricultural land. When it comes to some of the benefits domestically, I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these investments bring economic opportunities to many rural areas, especially when we're talking about broadly agricultural land or developments in that agricultural land. So to give you an example, there was a purchase attempt in North Dakota that got a lot of attention. It was by a Chinese, the Fufeng Group. They wanted to build a corn mill plant. It just so happened to be, I think, within 15 miles or so of a military base, so that project did not go forward. But it would have represented the largest economic opportunity investment in that town. And that's something that I think we see regardless of, who's behind what, the country of origin of who's purchasing the land. And I think Emily also mentioned this earlier, for companies or developments in this particular case, or even Smithfield, these are American workers that are working in these facilities. It's not foreigners that are coming in. And so I think that's something that also gets lost a bit in the coverage.
Yeah, hi, Rich Bowman with Nature Conservancy. Emily, nice to see you, one of those owners of that land. My question related to ownership is land represents a form of wealth, both in its internal wealth, its value, and also in its productive value. Has there been any economic analysis done on the impact of local economies and local communities when you have non-local ownership that's then taking wealth, productive wealth, and moving it someplace else? And that then, I ask that because then that becomes a policy question of, especially we see a lot of rural areas where we're seeing less and less wealth in those areas. And so I'm just interested in what analysis has been done on that and what potential policy initiatives might be taken to counter that, to protect these communities.
No, thanks for the question. So in terms of economic analysis that look at the impacts of extracting a natural resource by a foreign company or foreign owner, I'm not aware. That doesn't mean that there haven't been done, but what I can say is the data that we have from AFIDA is there's a lot of issues with the data that I think would prohibit that type of analysis because all that we have is the county where that purchase took place. And it is very hard to track down true ownership just because of the reporting requirements that have been in place. Now, what I have seen, and this is something that USDA did, because one of the main concerns surrounding foreign holdings of U.S. agricultural land is whether that's going to drive up land values. To the best that an analysis can be done with the existing data, and this is something that USDA did, there is no evidence that that has been the case. But I haven't seen any analysis that look at sort of the extraction of a natural resource like in forests to other countries.
Well, and I want to be clear, just to clarify, it's not about the natural resource, it's about the income and wealth derived from the natural resource, because we we grow it and process it here, but
Right.
if your annualized rate of return on that investment is 7%, that, none of that 7% staying in the community, that's going to wherever the source of the capital
Right, and I
is.
think that's where land, so I appreciate you clarifying, that's where land values would come in, because that, you know, the value of the activity that's taking place would sort of be reflected in the land value. And the analysis that has been done on that, shows that there's no evidence that, foreign holdings of agricultural land, are driving up, land prices.
Yeah, I just, I think there's two ways of looking at that question. One is how well are they managing the wealth of the land itself? But I guess the other question is, how confident are we that even domestic companies are keeping that wealth locally versus,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't wanna
It's the
swap.
story of the absentee landowner.
Thank you, Eric. Oh, she is. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sue Schenk. I chair the Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, and I work on a lot of agricultural issues, especially around young people getting on land or our actual farmers making a living and being able to earn more. So I'm very interested in this. I'll be diving deeper into your work. And my question is really a little aside of that, which is, when you were looking, for Dr. Ortega, when you were looking at the legislation, did you look at whether there were think tanks or nonprofits behind the legislation? Because that would also be illuminating for someone like me.
Yeah, no, Senator, and thank you for the question. That was not something that we focused on in our study. We were primarily focused on foreign ownership. But the question of corporate ownership in U.S. agriculture, I think that's something that's worth looking into, but it's not something that we were able to do within the scope of our study.
Hi, Eric Nordman from Michigan State University Institute of Public Utilities. And I have a question about kind of the cyclical nature of these concerns about foreign ownership. I kind of remember when I was young, there was a lot of concern about companies from Japan being large landowners, you know. So how much of this is kind of like a cyclical question or concern, and are there any trends over time? Thanks.
So I guess to your question, there have been, so the way that I've looked at this issue is primarily looking at state level activity, legislative activity. And there have been sort of upticks here and there, like we saw some earlier this century when there was sort of, concerns over the Chinese acquiring Smithfield. But really, what we've seen since 2023 is somewhat unprecedented. It's not something that we've seen in terms of this showing up at the state legislative level.
I would just, the trend factor, I guess one question I just have is, with the trends, is, are these associated with, how much of this is consistent out of other types of land ownership, right? Does that make sense? Is this, I think, to Eric's point, reminded me of all the concerns about Japanese buying up New York in the 1980s as well. And so it sort of seems like there's just good investment opportunities in the US, and it doesn't really, they're not looking at agricultural per se, or I guess that's sort of, I think, part of the question there is also just the currency values and the interest rates.
Yeah, no, and I think, so my comment were primarily focused on agricultural land ownership, but we've just recently begun tracking ownership and sort of year-to-year changes. So we don't have a good sort of historical picture beyond what's in the AFIDA database. And so I think that also constrains our understanding of how those trends have really evolved over time.
You mentioned that fire suppression has been sort of the focus, and then maybe we should go to risk management. I guess what I'm intrigued of is in Michigan, where we don't necessarily have a high fire risk. I could be wrong on that. Doesn't that mean in some cases that what would be the push to sort of, what's sort of the focus that Michigan should have in that realm? Should we be going to other states because of health? So can we be a leader in that way because we don't have those industries, that sort of dynamic where we have to just keep on snuffing out fires? Can we pilot other programs in that way?
Yes, yeah, so one thing, the nonprofit I was talking about, Michigan Forest Association, recently was awarded funding to cost share to landowners to do various things, one of which is to engage in prescribed burning practices. And it's a really excellent, as you said, Michigan's an excellent state to pilot these kinds of management activities because we have relatively lower risk, we have more often suitable conditions to do these kind of prescribed controlled burns, and to serve as a model for other states to engage in these types of management activities. And that's not to say that we don't have some ecosystem types. I don't know how many are familiar with jack pine and Kirtland warbler. That's a forest community type that really works well with fire as a management tool. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, around the state to engage in those projects.
Nathan Bryson, I work in Senator Weber's office. Question for Emily. I know you showed the data on the increase in hectares burned in Canada over the last couple years and how the number of fires we've seen hasn't changed. And obviously politically here in Michigan and across the US, we've seen some frustrations with the Canadians that they haven't been able to get those fires under control. Is the increase in the damage of the fires, I know you mentioned that they're in like hard to get to areas. Is that just an act of God? Like that's just where the lightning has been the last few years? Or has there been any like studies done on why in the last few years, like suddenly we've had a 10-fold increase in the damage of fires, even when 5 years ago we had the same amount of fires?
Yeah, great question. So I haven't dug as deeply into the literature on Canadian forest and fire dynamics as I could. I will say though that the lead up, so 2021, 22, and 23, and there's one particular paper I'd be happy to forward you, hot and dry conditions a lot earlier in the year. So it really was kind of a combination of the ignition source and then the overall weather patterns of that particular year. But then combined with, we can't ignore the legacy of forest management or lack thereof that led to a fuel buildup in those particular places. So, you know, in some senses it's sort of like wrong place, wrong time, wrong system, but in other ways I think there are things we can do to reduce and improve that level of risk.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I do apologize that I have to head out.
Yeah, it's 1 o'clock, so someone has to teach. So I've been there. I would like to thank everyone. We're thankful for your time you spent. We're thankful for these presenters. If you could just thank them one more last time. And thank you. We don't have an event for February, but we'll be sending it out. We'll find out what we're doing.
The ones on my light.
Well, it sounds like they're gonna say I don't know if that's gonna happen for sure. Is it on that?
I think if you go to the same place.